before I was on the DD board, I was a DD volunteer. Still am, but because of COVID, we're not doing the book club. And then also I've helped, or tried to help at least, do my part with the Emerging Leaders Program and doing a presentation on crucial conversations, which is kind of something that I value. So anyways, utmost respects for you guys. I'm hoping that today's presentation will be beneficial for you, whether it's in leadership at your job or in your pastimes, your church, whatever it is that you do where you want to affect change. I hope that this is useful. It should be. I'm presenting to you on a book called Extreme Ownership, which is, I think it's one of my favorite leadership books. I do read a lot of leadership books. I feel like these kind of soft skills are pretty beneficial in that you really don't get trained on them as part of your job usually. So you can be a total technical expert in things like communications and things like leadership tips and all that really don't, they don't come naturally necessary to everybody. So I like to study them a little bit. So this book I stumbled upon. It is military related. This is a book written by 2 Navy SEALs who held very interesting wartime positions, which I'm going to get into in a second, and really speak from experience in leading SEALs and Army soldiers and Marines in battle. And I think there's probably no greater place where leadership is important than in that situation. So I value a lot of what they have to say, and I think that the tips are very much transferable to civilian life. In fact, these guys went on after their military careers. They created a company called Echelon Front. And so as you read the book, you'll have the first part of the chapter talks about some experience they had at war. And then the second part talks about an application of what they learned to business, and they advise businesses on leadership development. So it's really an interesting book, but I got to tell you, you kind of have to be comfortable with the subject matter before you read it. They don't go into gruesome detail, but they don't sugarcoat what war is like either. And so it's not necessarily for everybody. So hopefully, maybe if it's not for you, hopefully this presentation, which really doesn't get into the war aspect of it much, will be useful. And then from a historical point of view, you can't beat the storytelling in this book. How many people have read the book? And I'll just raise your hand and okay, so we got one. Yeah, I didn't expect too many would have necessarily. I think that, if you can handle the wartime stuff, the aspect of it, I think you'll enjoy it because it's a real eye-opener into what Navy SEALs do in combat, and it's a real eye-opener into the Iraq insurgency war. So, I mean, it's informative. Anyways, enough about that. I'm going to share my screen real quick. I want to show you all, this is going to be sloppy, but I want to show you all a slide that kind of shows you who the guys are that wrote the book because it's interesting. Just a moment. Okay. And did that work? No.
Yes, we're seeing the authors on your screen.
Oh, great. Okay, good. For a minute there, I was a little disappointed in my technological skills. These are your authors of the book. One is Jocko Willink. You can read there, but 20-year active duty U.S. Navy SEAL. What's interesting about Jocko, not only does he look like what you think a Navy SEAL would look like, he also, after leading SEAL Team 3 and tasking at Bruiser in Ramadi, which was a real hot spot, kind of described as the epicenter of the insurgency in Iraq. After that, he became the officer in charge of training for all the SEALs on the West Coast, which is a huge responsibility. And you'll see also a Silver and Bronze Star recipient and achieved the rank of Lieutenant Commander. Leif Babin, 9-year, a little more junior, active duty U.S. Navy SEAL. He was a former platoon commander, which means that he worked underneath Jocko and was junior to Jocko at the time. He has since achieved the rank in the U.S. Navy Reserves of Lieutenant Commander, so he achieved the same rank and received a Silver and Bronze Star and Purple Heart Medal. And he was one of Jocko's primary leadership instructors in training the West Coast SEALs. And so what's cool is see, I bought the book, and I actually bought the book in order to do this presentation because I wanted to have a hard copy to write up and to use for creating notes. But I actually got the book through Audible and listened to it, and it's read to you by these two guys who literally sound like exactly what you think of a hardened battle Navy SEAL. I mean, it's like, and then we, it's wonderful. I mean, it's actually really entertaining to listen to because they kind of fit the part. But so that's interesting and fun. And then when we get to the cover chapter descriptions, this is basically, these are the chapter titles. And I'm going to get into what it's about, and then I'll show you a summary at the end. But extreme ownership is the first chapter. It really covers the essence of what this is all about. No bad teams, only bad leaders. Believe, check the ego, cover and move. Simple, prioritize, and execute decentralized command, and then leading up and down the chain. And what I like about this book is, all these leadership books, usually you can take one or two things from. I actually took a lot from them, and I felt like they were applicable. The things that the kind of key points that they had, I thought were useful. So that's why I wanted to talk to you about it today. Okay, so good. They were better to look at. I'm sorry. But anyway, so we've had some people that read the book. It starts out, like I said, extreme ownership is the first chapter. And what it is Jocko relays a story of when he was the task unit commander in charge of various platoons doing special operations. And what he describes is how in what's called the fog of war, they had a friendly fire incident where one of the Iraqi soldiers who was assigned to their task unit to assist was shot. And there's about 10 different reasons why that occurred. And they went through basically all of them in the book, but including that, plans were changing, but then the higher headquarters wasn't notified about that. The expectations to notify when something changed weren't made clear to the people down the chain. The locations of where friendly soldiers, including these Iraqis that were part of the mission, wasn't reported. The shooter admitted that he lacked PID, which is positive identification of the Iraqi. And there's a lot of confusion in these kind of urban battlefields because the populace looks like the enemy fighters, and the enemy fighters are often dressed just like the Iraqi army. So you had this issue where I'm not sure how they would have positively identified without asking or something. Are you a bad guy? But the issue was he didn't positively identify. So all of these bad things, these sequence of bad things happened that probably shouldn't have, and led to this incident. So, after something like that occurs, an investigating officer is assigned, the higher commander comes down. Everything gets put on hold, and it did in this. It's a huge deal. And Jocko describes it as a career-killing incident. I'm not sure, but I know from having conducted or advised on investigations, not into something like this, but into other things, it can be pretty stressful for those involved. So in the middle of all that, Jocko calls a meeting, and he's got his entire team there, and he says, hey, who's at fault? And, goes through, who's at fault? And each of these individual people along the way who had made errors all stepped up and said, no, I'm at fault. I did it. And Jocko, did not have to step up and say, this is my fault. But he did. He said, nope, this is my fault. I'm the leader. And, and there's some truth to that. I mean, in that type of environment, if you're in command, I think that he felt that was the honest thing to say. But he didn't have to. And so what that did is then he was willing to accept what went wrong. And he went through how it wasn't going to happen again in a very detailed way. And that was it. That was the end of it. and they kept it from happening again. So the essence of extreme ownership is kind of that you, as a leader, you take responsibility for all that's in your realm. Even if Jocko wasn't there with the SEAL team when the shot was fired, and he didn't design the comm plan, the communications plan, he wasn't in charge of the group of Iraqis that were on patrol that nobody knew about, that was part of, the individual that was shot was part of that. He wasn't directly in that way responsible, but yet this is his team and those are his people. And so he was responsible. And so it's a little different way of thinking about it. And so I'll ask just for a little involvement. What do you think? I mean, I know what my impulse is. I know how I feel, at least, when something goes wrong. I like to first make sure it wasn't me. And I just think that's a natural inclination. And maybe it's not, maybe it's just me, but that's how I feel. And I think that, but I suspect that's how a lot of people feel. And then how you respond to that's really the question. And that's really what this book's about. A question for the group, do you think that Jocko's boss had more or less confidence in Jocko when he did that? What do you think? Anybody?
I mean, I'll talk because I always talk. Yeah, I think that I would think it would have to, right? I mean, but I guess my question for you is that you said that Jocko spoke up, but he didn't have to. Why would you think he wouldn't have to?
I think that in the context of the book, it's easy to feel like, yeah, of course, and in kind of the way he lays it out, even, yeah, of course, that's his fault. He's responsible for all his people. But I will tell you that as you look up the chain of command in any institution, there's some point where at least half the people asked would say, you know what, that's not, the buck stops with him, sure, but really he's not responsible because, he couldn't have made sure that guy didn't pull the trigger, or that guy had positive ID, like they could have. I think that it's kind of like, let's say if here at my job, I have a teller who gets in a fight with a customer in the lobby, an argument, not a fight, but like an actual like verbal argument, maybe some cussing or something, and of course this didn't happen, but let's just say it did. Is that my fault as EVP? I think, Pam, that if you asked 10 people on the street to answer that question, I think at least 5 would tell you, no, it's not his fault. He can't control that. She was having a bad day. She didn't eat breakfast. There's things he couldn't control. But I will tell you that if you follow extreme ownership and you follow kind of what this book's about, you would say absolutely, because it's my job to train. It's my job to at least not train personally, but to make sure that people are trained, and not just trained on, hey, don't cuss at customers, but trained on, hey, it's like crucial conversations. Hey, this is a situation where it's getting ratcheted up. You're getting angry. You're feeling angry. How do you handle that? And that is actually a type of training, that you have to have in a situation where you deal with the public. And if you look at it holistically and kind of like, what's the best answer? And so, yeah. And so I think you would learn from that as a leader and implement that if you weren't already doing something like that. So does that answer your question, Pam?
Yeah, I think so. I
get your point with the question, though.
It's the knee-jerk reaction, I think, to not, right? I mean, if you weren't there, how could you know? But I think that by finding fault, I think is kind of like a one way to stop the progress of problem solving versus how do we all play into this exact same thing so we can all look at it equally and are part of it.
Yeah, absolutely, Pam. And actually, I feel like what you just said really encapsulated one of the main points, especially of chapter 1. I think that is the point. And the follow-up question to that, really for the group, is, well, how do you think his men, and in this case, just so you know, these are combat arms troops. So if I refer to them as men, these are actually all men in this situation. But how do you think that his subordinates felt when he did that? And what do you think? You're easy pickings because you're right next to Rachel.
Well, I can add my 2 cents worth. I think that they felt protected by him. I think that they felt like he had their back.
Absolutely.
My dad wasn't a military, so I thought I saw a lot of that happening, where the mindset of the troops under him was more important than him picking out who was at fault, especially as it went higher up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell you that, as both a subordinate and as a leader here, because I have one boss, plus I have our board of directors. I mean, I can tell you that I respect when I see this occur at the higher level, but also, I really, I try hard to be that way. But then also, if a subordinate takes responsibility, takes total ownership of a problem, I really like that. It makes me feel a lot more comfortable with the subordinate because I feel like the problem's going to get addressed. If it's more like, well, so-and-so didn't do it right, I don't like that. I mean, I get it, but I'm not sure that it solves my problem, which is to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And so for me, it's very useful. I enjoy it. And so what I mean by that is I think that it's probably, in a way, kind of a smart reaction and a better reaction from like a career standpoint. I think that it solves some of the issues that you get when somebody just kind of blames somebody else. So anyways.
Not to be against the name of the book, but I almost feel like it's a difference between responsibility and ownership. Like if I'm the person that messed that up, yes, I might be under you, but I can take that responsibility. But you're taking that ownership over all of us by being our leader and being the person where the buck stops. I kind of think, regardless of how you feel like the governor and Amy Acton handled the situation this spring, him going out and saying, you elected me. I'm the one that's taking responsibility for the actions of the Ohio Health Department. He was taking responsibility, even though he wasn't he didn't write that executive order.
Yeah, and your thoughts on the term ownership are interesting to me too. I know exactly what you're saying, and I think that ownership too is even taking such a drastic action and owning the issue. And when you look at the preparatory work that goes into when planning for a crisis, succession management, the things you do before crisis happens to make sure you're ready to handle them, that to me is ownership. And so we've talked about what happens when things go wrong. I think that the overall crux of the book, which we will get into a little bit more, is that it's ownership overall too. And so it is responsibility, but it's also the ownership of the whole, I won't say battlefield, but the whole issue, the whole climate.
Yeah, Matt, something else that I noticed there too is that, not so much when you're talking about something as critical as when someone is killed in the process, but I look at so many things that go wrong and how much time we spend trying to assign blame, and it's really and many times it's a wasted effort. That for me, accepting that responsibility has a way of focusing people not on what happened, but on how we're going to fix it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think,
Just
and I think
disarms
too,
it.
like what Ray says is interesting, because I think that there's a difference between taking responsibility and accepting fault, because fault and responsibility are really two different things, if you think about it.
Well,
Yeah.
and what do
So,
you?
I mean, someone may do actions, and I'm not particularly talking about this case we're talking about in the book, but someone may make a mistake, and it's not necessarily something you could have maybe, I don't want to say prevented, but it's not necessarily your fault. But by the same token, as their superior, it is your response. Like for me, I would take responsibility for that, to try and correct the situation or make it better, even though it wasn't something that I personally did myself.
Well,
Does
and
that make sense?
yeah, that does, Temple. I will tell you one other piece of this, which we haven't got into yet, but the idea of taking extreme ownership doesn't mean that the people who made mistakes, that's kind of, I don't want to say unpunished. It's not the right word, but it's not, you still have to deal with the mistake. And part of that is, if you're really taking extreme ownership, it's training, retraining, coaching, mentoring, all the things when it's easy to say, you're just a bad apple. You work with these people. And so that's part of ownership. The converse of that, though, is that once you've done that, if the situation isn't better and you feel like you're not making a difference and that this problem still exists, you still got to deal with the problem. And that could lead all the way up to even replacing that person with someone that can do the job. And that's part of ownership too. And it sounds callous to say it that way probably, but if you don't fix issues like that, you really can't, you're not really taking ownership as a leader. Which gets me to the second chapter. No bad teams, only bad leaders. And I thought this was interesting. The beginning kind of story on that is the boat crew teams that they do in training, where it's fascinating. These boat teams are assigned, I think it's 6 people to a team, and they go through the basic underwater demolition training, or BUDS. And what they do is these poor guys, they are, told, okay, you're going to row your boat out to that buoy and back. And if you're not the first boat team back, you lose. You're not number one, you're done. And you got to do it again, or you got to go, do some push-ups in the sand. I mean, all the stuff that goes on and on and on. And so you really want to win. So they're talking about these boat teams, and Blaif was an instructor of one of the BUDS trainings. And so what he was saying was there was this boat team that always won. They won every single time. And then there was this other boat team, which really always lost. And he could hear, from the shore, these guys are arguing with each other about who's at fault. The leader wasn't really taking responsibility. And in fact, the impression was is that the leader of the failing boat team really just thought he got dealt a bad hand and was given all kind of duds on his team. And I got to tell you, when you're in a leadership position, when things aren't happening the way you would like, that is a really easy gut reaction to get to. Like, oh God, these guys are awful, And that's what was going on here. And so what they ended up doing was they swapped out the leader from the best boat team with the leader from the worst boat team to see what would happen. And immediately the next run, the failing boat team with the new leader actually won. And then the second boat team, the second place loser, as it would say in the BUDS, it turns out, that was commanded or led by the guy that was previously on the failing team. And what they said is they thought that the culture of the winning team, the original winning team, was so strong that it carried over even when this leader, who had a lot of development to do, joined as their boat team leader. So, but the point of all of it, one point that I'd like to get across is that, and I learned this as a trial attorney, is that you don't learn anything from your wins. I mean, absolutely nothing, because you think, man, I rocked that. That was great. But you do learn from when you lose. And so what had to happen here was that this individual boat team commander leader had to realize, when he saw that his failing team of kind of losers, he thought, when they became the winners, I think at that point he realized, wait a minute, there's something that maybe I'm not doing that this boat team leader who's always winning did. And so sometimes it takes having some failures in order to realize, hey, I need to look inside. And a common theme for me, at least, between this class and then when I like to talk to people about crucial conversations, is really looking inside first and saying, well, what am I doing wrong, as the leader here? So, so that was that. They actually then went and they went a little further into what all that is about. And really, it's also dealing with your people too, because it may feel like your team members that you oversee or work with are duds, so to speak. But what are you doing about that as a leader? And one quote that I just love from the book is, it's not what you preach, it's what you tolerate. Rachel, did you pull that one out?
It is in my notes, sir, and it is highlighted in 3 colors.
Yeah, I love that quote, because as a leader, I mean, we've all seen it, but if the rules say you got to show up at 8 and you got people walking at 8:10, if nobody deals with that, everybody's going to come in at 8:10. I mean, it's no longer the rule, and it feels black and white to say that out loud. I hope it's not I know it's not quite like that, but I think that to some extent, though, it's a very valuable quote. And I see it all the time. I mean, if one of the best qualities of somebody in management is the willingness to approach the team when the team's not doing well and say, hey, you're not doing well. And it doesn't have to be in a way that is abusive. It doesn't have to be in public. It doesn't, there's a lot of little tips to the trade here in correcting people. But if you are not correcting mistakes or not worried about the standards, you have no standards. And so that is an important part of leadership at any level, whether you're leading 3 people or you're leading 30 people or you're a superintendent. I mean, these are things you have to do. And that's part of the idea that there's no bad teams, only bad leaders, because ultimately if the leader's enforcing the standards and is motivating and is kind of performing him or herself, well, then you've got, a team that ultimately functions better. And so that's really the point of
Excuse
that.
me, sorry. I relate that to my family. My team
Go
is
on.
my
Give
family
us a big
too.
tape, Rachel. I'd love to hear more about that. You probably shouldn't share it. I don't know. I'm cognizant that my wife will be watching this later, maybe, so I want to be real careful how I talk too. So do you guys agree that leadership is the single greatest factor in performance for a team? Anybody disagree with that? I had a question for you. Say you're the world's best ISC, the absolute best. I mean, you do everything perfectly, you or at least try to. You're very diligent. You got the right soft skills going on. What is that person ultimately the best ISC leader, the best supervisor of ISCs? Does it translate over automatically? No. And that's generally what I've witnessed too in my world is you, not to say that there's ever, I don't personally know the ISC leaders or anything really about them, but what I'm trying to say is, generally speaking, I've seen that in my various careers. I mean, it's not necessarily the best tactician or technical expert who then becomes the supervisor that has the best go at it, because those are different skills. And part of it is kind of these types of things. So, okay. I do think a point that they pull out of the book is that leadership can be contagious, and that if you have a strong leader or somebody who's trying to be a strong leader, that kind of invokes that within the team and vice versa. So I'm going to keep moving because I realize that I am behind schedule here for your time. Believe is chapter 3, and this one I really relate to and like. So at one point, higher command for Jocko and Leif and their team said, hey, you're not going on any missions unless you have some of these Iraqi soldiers with you. And the issue with that are, the SEALs are basically like a pro football team. I mean, this is what they eat, sleep, drink. This is what they do. These are the highest trained people that we have, and they're in the best physical condition. They've had years to become capable and all the technical things they need to understand. They don't progress if they don't. It's hard just to even become a SEAL, and then all those standards are maintained. And they're equipped like none other. They've got the best equipment to go with the training. So you combine that with the Iraqi army, which according to what's in the book is, largely, kind of uneducated, untrained, in poor physical shape. They just kind of describe them as not really even be able to do a few push-ups. And then some of their loyalty is questioned. There's a chance at least that they might not be totally loyal to the Iraqi regime and what the coalition forces were doing. And then on top of that, they're in the epicenter of the insurgency in Iraq. And so it was a tough time. And Jocko initially was like, heck no, we're not doing this. There's no way this can't work. These guys are, the world's best trained military tacticians. And then you got these other folks would be like me jumping in. I was a JAG, so I'm allowed to, I can tell you that I I was definitely not special forces. And so, it'd be like throwing me in the mix, and I could do nothing but slow him down. And so because of that, he was like, heck no, we're not doing it. Can't do it. But he knew he was the leader. And so what he thinks is kind of the golden question is why? Why? Does these U.S. leaders on the ground, do they want us all to fail? Do they want us to become casualties? What do they want? Mission failure? Why would they do that? No, they don't want us to fail. They don't want anything to happen to us. Why would they put us in this position? And so because he asked that question, he was able to get the answer. And really what it was is that they needed the Iraqis to start becoming prepared to take over this mission of security for the country in Iraq and to protect the population. And it wasn't happening up to them. So they had to get them out on what they call in the book on-the-job training, where they were going to just learn from doing, under kind of the protection of these great SEALs. And so the issue that Jocko then had to face is, after he figured it out, is he had to convey it to his team. And I think that this is the big point from this chapter, is conveying it to your team and the people that you supervise or just are on the team with you. Because ultimately, they have to understand why. And anyone anyone that's ever received an order or, a request or anything with no why attached knows how that feels. And they also know that if you don't understand the why, it's very hard to adapt on the fly when things don't go as planned and respond the way, with and accomplishing the mission, because you don't really understand the mission. You just have a task at that point. And so there's this book out there, Simon, I think it's Sinek is how you say the last name, but it Start With Why. I've read it. I got a couple of people shaking their heads that they've read it. It really goes into great detail on this topic. So I don't want to go into it a whole lot with this book because of that. I think if you agree with the statement that the why is important, you ought to read Start With Why, because it's great. But they talk about how there's this new compensation plan in this company they were advising, and all the salespeople were pushing back. And what do they want us to? They want the company to lose all of its salespeople to other companies where it's easier, and they went through all this stuff. And the issue that popped up, and this is kind of a corollary point that I think is important, is that there was great reason for why they were doing the new compensation plan, but nobody knew it. And the issue is that you had this really strong CEO of the company that was very well respected, and nobody wanted to kind of ask. Nobody wanted to challenge. The boss is still the boss at the end of the day. And whether that boss is a tyrant who you're afraid to talk to, or the boss is somebody that is excellent, that you respect, for either of those two reasons, you may not ask why, when you really need to know why. And you might need to know for yourself, but especially to make sure the people that work for you know too. And so it's something that leaders need to be cognizant of, is that, yes, you have to, as a leader, explain the why explicitly. You have to take that upon yourself. And you can't just think, oh, my people, like, I don't know how many of you are willing to go into John's office and ask him why a policy is what it is, or why are we doing this new procedure, or why are we staying at home, or why, because he's the boss. At the end of the day, he's the boss. And you don't know how that'll turn out, even with John being John, and, I don't see him necessarily biting people's heads off, but that's, you respect him, and you don't want that to happen. So you don't want to offend them. So bosses especially need to understand, I've got to tell people why we're doing things. With that, do you all ask why? Do you guys, if you don't know, do you ask your kind of immediate supervisor why? I'm seeing some head yeses. Let me flip over. Okay. Yep. We got yeses. A lot of yeses. Carissa, you're outside, you lucky duck. Are you outside? Okay, good. Next question for you, which you don't have to answer, but if you do supervise people, how do you respond when people ask you why? Do you feel challenged? I'm sure you feel challenged. I think that's normal. Do you react as if you're challenged? Do you react, or do you embrace that? And that's a question for you to answer internally and to think about next time it happens. if somebody's asking why, at a minimum, you need to clear up the why because it's useful. Especially if it's not, if it's not a total disrespectful public, kind of argument, and they're just asked, you probably clear it up. You'll have much better results, I think. So anyway, so that's the point on chapter 3. Chapter 4, check the ego. And they talk about how a new SEAL team to a base, didn't check their ego. They felt superior to the common regular Army troops who ran the base, wouldn't relay plans, wouldn't tell them coordinates, wouldn't give them information they needed to be properly supervised. And ultimately, they weren't allowed to fight in that realm, and they had to go back to a different base because the Army commander kicked them off. And they wanted to be there, so they kind of screwed it up. And so ego gets in the way. I love this quote. Ego clouds and disrupts everything. The planning process, ability to take good advice, ability to learn from constructive criticism. You guys all agree with that? Got some head shakes, yes? Yes. Cindy, I'm gonna put you on the spot only because you're right in the middle of my Brady Bunch. Cindy, do you think that for all of the stuff we're talking about as far as ownership and development and kind of improving yourself, does ego get in the way of that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's difficult, but one of the key points of the book, and one I love, is that it's not really the other guy's ego or the other gal's ego, it's your ego. You got to keep your own ego in check. Otherwise, you'll never grow.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a part of the book that I think is useful. They had a situation. Thanks, Cindy. I'll bother you again here in a minute. They had a situation where they were advising a company. A mid-level manager of the book called up frantically that they were working with and said, "Hey, my drilling superintendent just went off on his own, went rogue, and was supposed to run this thing by me and didn't, and used the wrong equipment, and the whole project blew up and cost us a ton of money." And that was an example of what they believed was the ego of the drilling superintendent, who had been far more tenured on the team and kind of in the past had let the boss know that he was the most tenured person on the team and knew what he was doing. And so obviously the mid-level manager who was in charge didn't care for the idea that this guy had gone beyond him and really thought it was because he thought the guy believed he knew everything and wouldn't take any advice and thought he was intentionally disobedient. And Jocko asked him, well, do you think that he intended to cost the company money? And, the guy's like, no. Did he understand that changing the tools that were used in this case would lead to X, which would lead to Y, which would cost the company money? No. Did you understand that? Yeah. So who's kind of responsible for this? And what it did is that question alone, looking inward, it caused this mid-level manager to say, hey, I have at least a piece of this, not the whole thing, but a piece, enough of a piece that he could stomach going to this drilling superintendent who he had kind of this little bit of a problem with and saying, you know what, this is partly my fault. I didn't explain to you why you have to run this stuff up the chain of command before you do it. And ultimately, it's a disarming thing. And I got to tell you, some people just naturally do this. I don't know if you've noticed it. Some people do this naturally, and I think it's a pretty good skill. For example, when I realize I've screwed up here at Fairfield Federal, it's usually because my boss will say, hey, I think I messed up and forgot to tell you something, but we usually do this every year, And, so some people already do this kind of, she's not formally trained in this or anything. She's just good at it. So, but the point is in dealing with other people's ego, well, first, your own ego, you got to realize what part you played in it and really think about that. But secondly, to the extent this is partly your fault, it doesn't hurt to fess up to that, because what you're going to do is kind of disarm and the person on the other side of the conversation, and you'll be more effective, which really goes into the crucial conversations piece that I like to talk about. But it's a takeaway from the book that I think we can all benefit from, is when you actually take responsibility for your piece of things, even if it's not the big piece, that will help you along the way. Any questions so far? We're at 12:42, and I kind of promised to get this done in an hour, and I think I probably should. I haven't seen a whole lot of people drop off yet. You guys are real troopers. Thank you. But I'll keep it moving. Let me know if you have any questions along the way. Chapter 5 is cover and move. And the way it worked out is you have these things called overwatch positions, where sniper teams with some machine gunners will go out into the populace, into the city in the middle of the night, where they have the advantage because of the night vision goggles. They will infiltrate a building, they'll get on the roof, and then as the Army troops and these other people who are doing different missions are doing them during the day, these guys are on the roofs, and they've been there for hours surveying to see where the enemy troops are, and then, if necessary, dealing with that issue to protect the lives of our service members who are performing the mission within the city. And so they have OP1 and OP2, Observation Post 1 and Observation Post 2. And Leif is in charge of both, but he is with the guys of Observation Post 2. And they're further out in the city. And what happens is they realize at some point, hey, we got to go. It's, the time to get out of there was now for them. Their position was known by the enemy, and they really had to beat feet and get out. And so they decided, well, how best to do this? We can call in the Army with the tanks and have them come escort us back. We can do, but that puts them in danger. There's other things they could have done, but ultimately they decided we're going to make a hasty kind of retreat back to the Cop Falcon, which was kind of their home base. And so they do that, and they're focused on themselves. They're really focused on, well, hey, this is dangerous. We're out in the middle of the city, kind of trekking through the city, it's an insurgent hotbed, in the middle of daylight. And so they did this. They got engaged. They had a firefight that sounded pretty tremendous from the book, and they did not lose any of the SEALs or Iraqi soldiers with them. And they got back, and they ended up, they're inside the gate now. There's a tank that blocks the entrance. They're relatively safe, and they're celebrating. Leif is like, yeah, we did it. We're all still here. We're all still alive. But what happened is in their hasty retreat and the decision, Leif says, okay, OP1, go back to the base, and we're going to follow on and come back too. But what he didn't realize, what he forgot is there might have been a better way to do it. He was so focused in on their immediate need to get back. They're celebrating, high-fiving and all that, and the seasoned chief comes up to him and says, hey, what in the world were you guys doing? And, it's kind of interesting. They're so much better at telling the story than me, obviously, but these guys have a knack for telling stories. But what's interesting about it is he's like, oh yeah. Yeah, so the other team could have covered us from their overwatch position. They were pretty close to the base. They could have covered us as we walked back and provided support and extra firepower against these insurgents that we're engaged with. And then we could have helped support them as they came back with our machine gunners. And it's like, oh, yeah, they were so focused on their individual immediate problem that they forgot about the rest of the team. And that's really kind of the main point of that chapter. And they kind of related this to the real world through, they were advising this manufacturing company that was reliant upon a distributor that was a subordinate company, like a subsidiary. And they were experiencing all these delays and downtimes and extreme costs because they couldn't get the product out because the person distributing it couldn't get it out, so they had to shut down. And they described the subordinate company or the subsidiary as completely awful. It's a bunch of losers. They can't even get the product. They can't even do this. Really coming in, taking a stick kind of thing. And Jocko says to him, well, how can you help them? And the guy says, help them? They're not my problem. They have a different president. I can't help them. What am I going to do? And Jocko says, well, it sounds like they are your problem because you're forced to use them because they're the subordinate company, but you can't get your product out. And so therefore you can't keep producing product. So they are your problem. And what ended up happening is just that questioning that led them to think, they ended up putting people from the manufacturing company in the planning committees with the subordinate distribution company and vice versa. And all of a sudden, this us versus them went away. You guys, I don't know if I want to ask. I can tell you that in every single job I've ever had, there's been an us versus them. Whether it's this team over here doing this or this team over here doing that, and they just don't get along for some historical reason 20 years ago or whatever, there's always a us versus them. And I suspect there's probably an us versus them with you guys too, if I had to guess. I don't know. I have no clue what it would be, but I'm guessing there is. And to the extent that as a team you have a mission, you know, the point of this chapter in the book is that, you know, if you can get past that, you can probably, you know, get a lot more done. You know, if you're going to spend 8 hours a day doing something or 9 hours a day doing something, you might as well get it done, right? And you guys have such an important mission. It's like, if you can look past some of these things and work together for the greater good and be more effective as a team, that makes that 8 hours probably all the more worthwhile. And that's the way I feel about it here, you know. But I got to tell you, I'm sure for you too, you know, there are people that do not see it that way, and that's a challenge. It's a leadership challenge. But as a leader, you're responsible for that. Extreme ownership, right? So, all right. Any questions so far on all that? Okay. I'm doing a lot of talking. We'll have to start asking some questions here. Simple is chapter 6. I'm going to not go into a whole lot of detail on that because I think it's actually kind of an easy concept, but you've got to keep it simple. And if you're the one giving direction, keep it simple. Chapter 7 is prioritize and execute. And I think this one's important, especially for new managers and people that are new to supervisory positions. The example in the book, they're stuck on this rooftop. While they were in the building and on the roof, the insurgents figured it out, and they placed a humongous IED next to the door. And so these guys, these SEALs, they couldn't get out. They're stuck in this concrete building. And on the roof. So what they ended up doing is they took a sledgehammer to the concrete wall on the second floor, I believe, and they made a big hole, big enough for these huge dudes with all their equipment to get through. And then the hole went out onto this roof of the neighboring building. And their idea was if they're down to one story, they might be able to hop down or do something to get out, versus going through the door, trying to disarm the IED and potentially blowing everything up. And so they're out on this rooftop of the building next door, and the guy takes a step, and what he thinks is the roof, but as you might guess, it was just a tarp covered with dust, and so it wasn't the roof. And the guy fell down to the ground, was injured, and now they're stuck on an exposed rooftop. Unknown how badly he's hurt, but somehow they got to get him back. And on top of that, there's a bomb that is huge, and it could go off at any time, but will definitely go off if they try and take the easy way out. So what do? And so the SEALs in the book, they kind of confess that this is what they're trained for. You know, they are trained to do what's called prioritize and execute. And I think it's important because, what they did is what's the first priority? Well, we've got to set security. So that way we can respond if there's somebody that says, hey, they're sitting ducks, let's get them. 2, they got to find a way off that rooftop. And then 3, they got to get a head count once they're down the road to make sure they have everybody. So that way, the IED can blow up and not hit any of them. And they ended up taking out the IED with a charge. So even the most competent leaders can be overwhelmed if they take on too many tasks at once. And so the first time you become the ISC supervisor or director of this, whatever it is, there's probably a list of 10 things that, because you were in the position before, that you'd like to fix, change, or enforce. And the point of the book is to prioritize and execute, with the idea that if you try and do all of them at once, none of them are going to get done. And I got to tell you, this is a leadership issue. All my leaders, raise your hand if this is an issue. I'm seeing some hands. I mean, literally, if you've got 6 or 7 things on your plate, it's difficult. And so you got to pick which one you want to execute and get it done, and then move on to the next one. And that's a hard thing to do. So they had a pharmacy company they were advising. They were losing big time money. And the CEO interview went like this. in response to how they're going to fix it. Well, I'm going to open 6 new product lines, 12 new distribution centers in different markets, and I'm going to start selling a different type of equipment. We're doing pharmacy stuff now. Well, using our inroads into the hospital, I'm going to sell lab equipment. And then on top of that, we're going to revamp the activities of our sales force. We're going to retrain and revamp our sales force. And then Jocko asked, which I think the question, all you were probably asking is, well, which one's the most important of all of those? And so, and he said, well, we're going to have to revamp the sales force activities. That's job number 1. So they ended up focusing the entire company on the revamping of the sales force and the marketing. And so they opened up their lab. The lab guys opened up the lab and for customer tours. The marketing team got together. They did videos from their best salespeople on tips of the trade to give out to the not so best salespeople. New marketing pamphlets, stuff like that. So literally the whole company just focused on the one issue and they knocked it out and they moved on. And so it's a leadership issue. It's worth talking about. I think that's one of my challenges is getting anything done because I've got so many kind of things going on here, So next up is really chapter 8, Decentralized Command. The story that they tell is they've got a sniper team out there in a building, and they have several sniper teams out there in different buildings because that's what they do. But then they had the Army reported back and said, hey, we've got enemy snipers in building 79. And, they just had a death from a sniper. I think it was a week before. And so this is, believe it or not, the insurgents have snipers too. And this is a big deal. So they wanted to take out, using a Bradley fighting vehicle, this sniper or group of snipers. And they wanted to do it in particular before the snipers shot any of the Army troops that were out doing their mission. And so, so there's this huge string of radio traffic back and forth with Jocko saying, hey, verify again, building 79. And so the Army guy, verify again, Army guys, that this is building 79. And it went back and forth like that for a while. And basically it seemed like they might have checked like 5 or 6 times in 5 or 6 different ways. And ultimately Jocko says, well, count the buildings from the nearest intersection. And that way we can figure out, well, how close or which building it actually is to make sure it is actually building 79 where these snipers are, because our friendly snipers were not in building, or were not in building 79. So anyways, the idea is that Jocko, through asking that question, was able to figure out that, hey, no, they're not in. They had the building number wrong, and actually it was the friendly snipers, the SEALs, that would have been blown up by the Bradley fighting vehicle. So the point of that was, and what Jocko says is, hey, if I'm down there worried about, doing tactical things and deciding how to deal with the problem in the minutia, that I would have never been asking these questions and taking the time to verify. And I would have felt the urgency and the pressure to just make the call. And so what he's saying is this decentralized command and having these folks that are actually trained and empowered beneath him allowed him to be able to stop and think strategically and think of the higher level issues. And I think that is a good point and totally true. And I don't know about you all, but I get pulled into minutia every hour. And it's something that you have to be very careful of, because if you do that, you have no time for what you really should be doing as a leader, which might be the higher level stuff. So it's probably true, I imagine, for your ISC supervisors and other supervisors and your directors that, to the extent that you are pulled into ISC stuff or other things, you're not really doing your job. And it's probably not entirely true in the context that I'm using it, but just think of it kind of maybe other positions where it might apply. So that was kind of the main point of that with the decentralized command. And again, the key points of that are, these people have to be empowered to lead and make decisions at their level, but that doesn't mean that they don't have to report up on what's going on so that the leader is aware of the situation and is able to actually make strategic decisions. So that is important. And also, these folks that are empowered have to clearly understand the left and right boundaries of what they are allowed to do, because it can't become chaotic. You know, there has to be order to it, but it's also, they have to be empowered, because if you don't empower the people that are subordinate to you or your team members that you're directing, you're going to end up doing it yourself. And then you're not leading the team. And so that's kind of the key point of that. A final point, chapter 10 is leading up and down the chain. And, you know, leading down the chain is, you know, Leif is sitting there watching Jocko do his out brief as they leave Ramadi, and they're briefing the new commander on what they did. And he's able to see on a map how they had taken control over the insurgent areas. Maybe it started out this big, and then now they own this much of the landscape where they have control over the insurgency. And it was at that point that Leif, who was a platoon leader, meaning he was boots on the ground doing these missions, that he realized, first time that he realized what they had accomplished. And he thought to himself, oh my gosh, you know, what if my SEALs could have understood the impact we were making along the way? And, you know, and they don't even know now, you know. So it was kind of a really interesting revelation for him. And so that's leading down the chain of command and explaining down how your role, individual role, contributes to the overall mission, and making sure that that takes place. That's an easy thing to forget. I mean, we're all stuck in the day-to-day, and it's easy to forget to do that. And then leading up the chain of command, which is also important, you know, they're getting all these requests for what they called kind of stupid information, stuff that was irrelevant, that didn't make any sense. Why would they even ask that question type of stuff? And right before the missions, when they should have been doing other things. And what they realized is they needed to ask, what can we do better as the subordinates on the ground, so that these higher level commanders understand enough that they aren't asking these types of questions. And so then they have to give them situational awareness up. So we're very close to the end. That was really kind of the main point that I wanted to get across there, and that's our last chapter. I wanted to kind of just ask you to think if people that follow you understand really their role and how it supports the overall mission. And then think to yourself, is there some requirement, process, something that people are just complaining about that could just be explained, that they don't understand how it fits into the big picture? You know, they don't understand the why. I think the two are kind of related. So with that, I'd like to do a quick summary. I'm going to try and share my screen and hope for the best on this. Can everybody see that?
You got it.
The extreme ownership is, you know, I can tell you that I believe, at least personally, that it will lead to positive results with both your people that supervise you and also the people that you supervise. I think that when you accept that this idea that there's no bad teams, it's not your team's fault, it allows you to really own your problems, and in order to, is what the IoT stands for, in order to develop solutions. And I think if you just blame the team or blame others, think they're duds, whatever, it really stunts your growth, because you're not looking to see how you can improve it. Believing is starting with why. Checking your ego is obvious. Leaders, you got to keep the focus broad and consider the whole team, even when you're knee deep in muck and you're dealing with your own issues. Keep it simple. Prioritize for maximum effect. You got to empower your subordinates, lay out clear expectations for communications so that you don't lose track of what's going on. And then also make sure that they know and reaffirm what the left and right boundaries are of their authority. And then you really got to explain the big picture to your subordinates. And you got to push situational awareness up the chain of command. So I think those are the key takeaways from the book. Let me zoom back in. I hope that this hour has been worth your time. If not, read the book anyways, because the book's actually much better than my description of the book. So thank you all for your time today.
Matt, thank you for your time. I have lots of notes that I wrote down on lots of quotes.
Good. Thanks again.
Thanks, Matt.
Enjoy.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Keep up the good work, everybody.
Thanks.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks.